You are listening to The Central Cast, a podcast for mystics and misfits just like you, recorded every week in Pasadena, California, before a live audience. Thanks for tuning in. One of my favorite stories in the Gospels is the story of Doubting Thomas and so-called Doubting Thomas. That's a name that we gave him, not the name that the text gave him. But my guess is many of you are aware of what that story is about. As the story goes, Jesus' disciples were all together in the upper room after his resurrection, except for Thomas. And the Lord appeared to his disciples for the first time, and it was this incredible experience. But of course, Thomas wasn't there, so Thomas shows up sometimes later. And his friends tell him, "Oh my gosh, you missed it, man. He was here. The Lord is alive and well. He appeared to us." And Thomas scoffs and he says, "Have you guys been smoking those funny green cigarettes you got from Lebanon again?" Something like that. Oh, not really. But basically, he's like, "I will not believe this unless I see him for myself and I'm able to touch the scars in his hands and feet." And so as it came to pass, the Lord appears again to his closest of followers, and Thomas is among them. And the Lord says, "Thomas, come here, put your hand in my side where they speared me, and touch, put your finger into the nail scars into my hands and feet." Thomas does, and he exclaims in astonishment, "My Lord and my God." My favorite interpretation of this story comes from the late Terence McKenna, who pointed out that among all the disciples, it was Thomas the doubter who got to touch the risen Lord. He alone got this incredible experience because he was the only one who had his shit together enough to doubt, to question, to doubt the resurrection. And so if you doubt, if you question your faith, if you dig deeper and beyond simply what the church tells you to believe, then you will discover aspects of the divine that you couldn't otherwise. There is a dialectical relationship between faith and doubt, or doubt and spiritual awakening. Dialectical means a coincidence of opposites, or a harmony between seemingly contradictory things like light and darkness, joy and sorrow, life and death, atheism and theism. Once one pushes past the superficial and seemingly contradictory nature of such things, one discovers they're actually deeply intertwined and reliant upon each other. Faith and doubt have this dialectical relationship where doubt is the gateway to a deeper kind of spirituality and faith, a faith beyond belief, if you will, or a faith after belief. Doubt makes us push past naive belief so that we come into contact with the absolute, or the God who is beyond being, beyond comprehension, beyond what any single religion or sacred book could ever possibly tell us. But the only way to get there, into what I would call a kind of mysticism, is through the crucible of doubt and unknowing first. There is no other way. This is the way to touch God, if you will, to put your hand into his side, touch the scars on his hands and feet. So Doubting Thomas is actually a paragon of faith. He's actually a powerful example of exactly how to go about one's faith journey instead of rather how not to. But this opens up a larger conversation I want to have today about a spiritual principle, if you will, that has been deeply influential on me and others, I feel, in post-evangelicalism. And this principle is called the fidelity of betrayal. The Fidelity of Betrayal, which is actually the title of a 2008 book written by our old Irish friend, Peter Rollins, who very well might be speaking here the first Sunday in December. We're working on that. He's been a big influence on me and others. But he coined this wonderful turn of phrase, the fidelity of betrayal. What does that mean? It's a dialectical phrase, right? It's a coincidence of opposites. And he used it to say, perhaps the most Christian thing one could do is to leave the church and Christianity as an act of fidelity to Jesus' teachings, Jesus' ways. Think of it this way. In a time where all kinds of hate and fascist ideas are rife within the American church, perhaps the most Christian thing one could do is to leave the church. Many have, right? We're aware of that. Others have joined liberal and progressive communities like this one. And that too is a way of embracing the fidelity of betrayal. Because here we embrace and explore such ideas and critique and reject what's often going on out there in the mainstream church, right? Many of us came out of that, but we're here and we're labeled, this ragtag bunch of wannabe Christians or whatever they call us, right? Woke Marxists, I don't know, something like that. Troublemakers, misfits, but certainly not Christians. Well, there's a fidelity of betrayal going on here, right? And let me pause for a second and say that this principle applies also to the way that we think about ourselves as Americans today, too. Perhaps the most American and so-called patriotic thing one could do right now, as we slide into authoritarianism and fascism, is to refuse to say the Pledge of Allegiance or to sing the national anthem at a ball game or to do other so-called un-American things as a form of protest. These are all the ways of practicing the fidelity of betrayal. As Julie pointed out to me this week, Thomas Jefferson once said, dissent is the highest form of patriotism. This, too, is what it means to practice the fidelity of betrayal. This is what it looks like in our American context, if you will. But let's get back to our Christian context. Jesus, of course, is the best example of this. Consider that his entire ministry was basically done in betrayal to or in opposition of the religious establishment, right? And the religious authorities and the religious leaders of his day. There are too many stories that reflect this, but my favorite is probably the one where the religious leaders call him out for breaking the Sabbath, a crime punishable by death, according to the book of Exodus. In all three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we find this story of Jesus healing a man with a withered hand on the holy day, the Sabbath day. And the Pharisees confront him by saying, and I'm paraphrasing, hey, the scriptures say no working on the Sabbath, and you're working, you're healing this man. Keep in mind that wonder workers, miracle men, magicians were common back then, we're told. This was considered a kind of profession. To which Jesus responds to his detractors, is it wrong to do good on the Sabbath? Right? Elsewhere, he responds and says, the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. In other words, you've put the cart before the horse. If your religion and your scriptures are getting in the way of human well-being, then you need to change the way that you relate to, read, and understand your religion and scriptures. This is what he was saying when he said, the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. That was kind of a radical thing to say. The book of Exodus and elsewhere, it says anybody who works on the Sabbath is to be put to death. Here we see how Jesus actively betrayed the letter of the religious law for the sake of the spirit of the law, for the sake of upholding the spirit of the law. And the spirit of the law, he argued, was what? Love and justice and compassion and mutuality, care and concern, especially for the poor and the powerless and the oppressed and the downtrodden and the infirm and the marginalized. We all know this, right? Therefore, the one who practices these things is being faithful to the scriptures and to God, regardless of how good they are about their piety or their ritual observance of the law. And of course, the religious leaders of Jesus' day didn't want to hear any of that. They had a zero tolerance policy for the fidelity of betrayal. And if you notice, most of the church today does too. If I preach this in most churches this morning, it would not be received well, which is fascinating because, our fellow Christians, they have the same Bible we do. And yet they miss this message in it entirely. They have the same stories as us about Jesus betraying the letter of the law in favor of the spirit of the law. And yet so many choose not to see this. and they wonder how we became such blasphemous heretics, as if Jesus himself didn't show us how. We were discipled by the master, my friends. But it makes sense why almost no one sees this or talks about it, because think about it. The implications for this idea, they're major. The main implication being you can't build a really powerful and wealthy institution like the church unless you create and enforce all these rules and laws about doctrines and beliefs and traditions, with the threat that if you don't adhere to them and submit your life to the church, you are doomed. You can't build a truly powerful religious institution and generate the kind of wealth that the church has done over the centuries unless you structure it that way. If you structure it instead on love and, open-mindedness and inclusivity, and the idea that we're all beloved children of God, regardless if we're Christian or not, you can't build a truly powerful and wealthy religious institution on those ideas because they're not controlling enough. It's not coercive enough. You need the fear of God and the fear of hell and the promise of divine reward and eternal bliss on high in order to fill the pews and fill the coffers. It's a sad state of affairs. But this is why these ideas and this fidelity of betrayal at the heart of the gospel, this is why this never took off. Even though I think the early church really tried to embody it and embrace it. I mean, why else did the first Christians, who were Jews, right? The first Christians, the first followers of Jesus, these were Jews. Why did they stop? Why did they reject the so-called eternal rite of circumcision? Why would they stop keeping kosher? Why did they stop observing the Sabbath and all these other customs and traditions that their scriptures told them to practice or else? Why would they do that? Not that there's anything wrong with having religious traditions and practices, Jewish ones in particular, but why did they let that stuff go? Unless they believed it wasn't serving them well, and that Jesus, their rabbi, had shown them that the spirit of the law trumps the letter of the law, and that what God really wants from us is love and compassion, inclusivity and mutuality. Remember that passage in Micah 6:8 that we've basically labeled our church's inspiration passage, right? What does the Lord require of you, O mortal? But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. That wasn't Jesus, that was Micah, one of the minor prophets, centuries before Christ. Jesus, in essence, was like the last prophet in a long line of Hebrew prophets who really preached this idea that ultimately it's the spirit of the law, love and justice, that triumphs or trumps over the letter of the law. But Jesus embodied and emphasized these, we would call them deconstructive ideas, this fidelity of betrayal, more than anyone else. And I think his earliest followers got that. I think the early church got that. And in a sense, we today, we so-called post-evangelicals, are reclaiming that original incendiary deconstructive element, this original fidelity of betrayal. We're not the first. There have always been those in the church who have done this. I'm thinking of medieval mystics, some medieval misfits and mystics like Meister Eckhart in the 13th century. He was a Catholic, basically a priest and a theologian, and who was famous for saying, I pray that God may rid you of God. I pray that God may rid you of God, which is a shocking thing for a priest to say. What's he talking about? Well, this is a rephrasing of his personal prayer, oh God, rid me of God. And to be clear, he wasn't an atheist, but his words here, they're a bit atheistic, because what he's saying is we must rid ourselves of the God of the mainstream church. This is what he thought. We must rid ourselves of certain conceptions of God that do not serve us or others well anymore. Remember, he was a mystic, so he's talking about shedding the constraints of human understandings of God and being freed from limited or preconceived ideas about God. He's talking about embracing doubt and unknowing, like St. Thomas did, in order to allow for a deeper and more expansive understanding of the divine and a direct experience of God. This is what he was talking about. This was his fidelity of betrayal. And he believed that to the degree that we learn to do this is also proportionate to the degree that we learn to live in love as Christ did. This is what he was talking about. And he caught hell for it. The medieval church didn't want to hear that prayer, God, rid me of God. Or his mysticism, his idea of oneness with the divine, oneness with God. They didn't want to hear any of that. It was deconstructive. It was too expansive, too inclusive. It defied the letter of the law that the church was living by, you could say. And in general, the church never has liked it, even today, right? But notice the dialectical nature of his prayer. God, rid me of God. Notice the coincidence of opposites here, whereby one prays to God to rid oneself of God. The deepest spiritual truths are really always dialectical in nature like this. They're a kind of coincidence of opposites, whereby one begins to realize how everything is interconnected and one. The deepest spiritual truths are dialectical because they force us to go deeper and beyond the mere superficial and apparent, dualistic binary appearance of things, and embrace instead the oneness and the interconnectedness of all things. It's about seeing oneness and connection all around you and within you, and your oneness and connection to others. This is the real depth dimension, you might say, of our spiritual walk, of this Christian message, I believe. And this is where the fidelity of betrayal as a spiritual principle leads us, I think. And so that's my talk for this morning. And as always, we want to open it up for dialogue, for questions and remarks. Anybody want to? Yeah, Jason.
I struggle with this one because this rejection of the common or normal quote unquote interpretation of the books is what the fascists are doing right now. They're redefining or trying to redefine what a person is in the Constitution. They're reinterpreting the law around what terrorism is, or what or immigration law, all these things. Like they're doing that rebellion against the common normal of the day,
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think we're in we've deconstructed as a country, and now we're starting to try to reconstruct. And the values that you promote, the ones that you want to build your society on, that's where we're fighting about right now. And one side is choosing white supremacy as a value, and another side was choosing diversity, inclusion,
Liberal values.
yeah. And I think we really need to focus on promoting living the values that we want in the society, empathy, curiosity about our neighbors and each other. And we need to really reconstruct this idea of what America is, because it's already been rebelled against. It's just the other side that's doing the rebelling, So
Well, it's an interesting point of view. I think they would certainly see themselves in the way that you depict them as, representing even in their fascistic authoritarianism, representing the true heart of the Constitution. I think, and they would make that argument,
I don't even know if that's true. I think they may be thinking of, let's remake it in the image of what we want, but we used to have these norms. We used to have these ideas of, a system of government or way of what being an American was, and they're rejecting all of that. So they are rebelling. I mean, it's a rebellion. It's not, and I think we need to see it like that. It's not. I don't think our point of view should be fighting against the authority, because they're not the authority yet. They're the rebellion from normal America.
Mm.
So reframe a little bit, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Other thoughts, remarks? Yeah, Abe.
Well, I just responding to Jason a little bit. I kind of, it's really, in this political situation, in terms of like rebelling against the Constitution, I view it a little bit more as like a tug of war, because there's always been that kind of, and the same thing happens religiously over the Bible as well. Any kind of like, written document that is sort of like the thing you're basing your life on or your society on or whatever. There are like various camps that will push and pull on it in their own self-interest. And so it's like, what they're trying to do right now with the Constitution is not all that different than what we're trying to do with it. The difference is, in my view, of course, one is in the right morally and one is not.
Yeah.
But it's still like there's nothing intrinsic in the Constitution that even says one side is correct or not correct, because we are as we pull towards including other people in the protections of the Constitution. Those are things that the people that wrote the Constitution probably wouldn't agree with.
Right.
So we are reinterpreting the words that they put down, to suit our own view of what's just and right.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's consistent with what their views are and what many of them may have thought had they lived in our time,
But we don't know.
Yeah, exactly. But we don't know.
Yeah.
Now, if you would look on the sort of the more conservative side, they want to do away with things like freedom of speech and the limitations of the presidency. Well, those debates were had at that time too. There were certainly people that were advocating for much more king-like presidency, even in the Constitutional Convention, and so their views are not totally inconsistent with that time, and definitely in terms of excluding people that are all outside of Christian morality, all that kind of stuff. It is consistent with a lot of the views. So it's like we're all kind of tugging back and forth, So I feel like sometimes I feel like it's not very useful exactly to just go back and make an appeal to what the Constitution used to be, or what used to define what America is, but really, it's to make the case now for what it should be, and to make the case that we are making progress and we should be working towards that, and again, just not to sort of like contextualize it as you're perverting the Constitution.
Yeah.
In your view. And, in some respects, I would agree with that. They certainly are. But in like that same argument can be used against us.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I mean, that's that I think is the historical reality.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Do you think we could argue that the underlying values of Western liberalism as a whole, including the French Revolution, that the underlying values of the American and French Revolution and the Western liberal experiment since the Enlightenment has been for increasing human rights, broadly speaking, and in essence giving the individual more rights as opposed to centralizing power among monarchies and authoritarian structures? I think we can make that argument.
Yes.
And therefore, from that fact, I think it's a fact that that's kind of the underlying ethos of the Western liberal experiment for the last 300 years, which has given the world human rights as never before. Okay, I think we can stand on that ground without holding up the Constitution, as you they say, and shaking it.
Yeah, in essence, those are Enlightenment values.
Thank you.
They aren't and they are reflected in the Constitution, but the Constitution is like a document informed by the Enlightenment, but it's also like it restricted the rights of slaves in this country. There's women did not have the right to vote at that time, and there was already within the Enlightenment intellectual movement, there were already voices that were starting to kind of talk about enfranchisement of women and the political process and all that kind of stuff. All of that stuff was excluded, and not accepted by the people that drafted the Constitution, and so. So it's like those like big, broad, like Enlightenment values. Yeah, I completely agree that it's like, I think our point of view on all this stuff is consistent with that. We should feel encouraged and reassured morally by
Yeah,
that.
I think so.
You know, that we're on the right side of history.
Yeah.
You know, but again, it's like it is a little bit complex because it's like if you frame the argument in a certain way, you got to remember that in some ways we're vulnerable to the same kinds of, because again, that's why you can make that comparison with the Bible too. You know, where it's like we can talk all we want about how our view of Jesus is really the right one. You're misunderstanding Jesus.
Yeah.
It's like you can't really say that because it's like, well, the Bible has a lot of different points of view in it. The New Testament has a lot of different points of view in it. And so it's like if you frame your argument in that way, it could just get very easily undercut.
I think you're right
in a way. So,
and I do like making that argument.
Yeah,
I do. And part of that's part of my. You can take the boy out of evangelicalism, but you can't take the evangelicalism out of the boy. I think there's some truth to that for me, and maybe for some others. And I accept that critique. I'm imperfect. I mean, I don't mean it like that. It's like crass. Oh, I'm imperfect. But I think it's a good critique of me.
I didn't mean to critique you. But...
No. I'm projecting, Abe. I'm making this about myself. You didn't make it about me. But no, but you so you made a good point that I wanted to go back to that keeps coming up for me, that I kind of want to ask you all what you think about this, put it back to you. And that was, I just want to make sure you get my thoughts straight about it. I think there's this false moral equivalency taking place in our culture right now, whereby the left and right are seen by centrists and moderates, and maybe even by some of those on the left and the right, as being kind of like morally equivalent in their agenda and objectives. As you said, it's like a tug of war, push and pull. Moderates and centrists tend to make this argument a lot. Oh, you guys are all just for power, and ultimately you're both really, biased and intellectually dishonest and unable to see your own blind spots. And this is just a power struggle. Okay, some of that's true, but one side wants human rights and to help human rights for people of color, brown folk, black folk, trans folk. One side wants that. Let's be very clear. And the other side wants to sustain hegemony and historical status quo of white supremacy, male supremacy, cis hetero supremacy. Okay, so let's be clear. Like this idea that all sides are morally equivalent. I'm sorry, they're not. One side really is fighting for freedom and equality for people who have historically been harmed and killed because of their bodies, because they're trans bodies or their brown bodies or their black bodies or their socioeconomic status. One side is fighting for power so that they can bring an end to the oppression over here. Okay, largely, I'm speaking in generalities, but do you agree with that idea, that this moral equivalency that's taking place between left and right among moderates, is a problem? Like, and you're saying, like, oh, we're all Antifa here, right? They would say, you're Antifa, so you're just as bad as the hard right, as the Nazis on the hard right. Come on. That's lazy thinking. That's just not true. And this idea that we're just as power hungry as the right for the same reasons. No, we're not. We're not fighting for the same things here. Right and left, I mean. I think that's to be very clear today in this broader conversation where we're fighting over the Constitution, which is beside the point, really, as you well said. Does that make sense? Anne, you want to comment, or Sarah?
Yeah, I get that from a friend of mine who's on the far right, who, if you bring up anything on the right,
take a beat.
anything on the right that's happening, he will give immediately an example that he considers equivalent on the left, because it's very lazy thinking, in that he thinks that creates a moral equivalence.
Yeah.
And it's a really frustrating conversation to have. Consequently, we don't have these conversations very much.
Yeah.
I don't want to derail the conversation away from that. So anybody who has another comment after, but I wanted to go back to something that Abe was saying about the Constitution, but related back to the Bible and Christianity. I think, so when I gave up the idea of the Bible being infallible, it opened up like this whole different view of what the Bible was trying to tell me. Because the evangelical model to me is very static. It's trapped in this like morality is based on a morality that was the morality 2,000 years
Circular.
ago.
Yeah.
And so consequently, growth is really difficult to come by because you have to do it within these really strict constraints, as opposed to seeing the foundational ideals that Christ taught us, the trajectory of morality that you can see through the Bible from, beginning to end, how it's so different. Even if you go from the end of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New Testament, things are so very different.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's an evolution of morality that is happening that is thwarted, I think, in many ways by a strict adherence to the Bible as absolute truth.
Yeah.
As opposed to the ideals as absolute truth. Christ's ideals. I think if I'm going to go to anything, it's going to be the ideals that Christ taught of love your neighbor. Like, that's so simplistic and horribly difficult. And so if everything can be taken through that lens, then it's not that nothing else in Scripture is instructive, but as society evolves, if I can push everything through that lens and say, does this fall into that one core truth? Then, but the way evangelicalism taught me was, here are the rules. And they remain very simplistic and are exclusive inherently exclusive.
Yeah.
As opposed to inclusive and expansive. They're not continuing to expand.
Yeah.
They're continuing to protect.
Yeah.
And I think it's very similar to what was being said about the Constitution. Of course, it's a document and it contains some ideals that we want to move towards. And it was imperfect. And it, one side is moving to constrain it more, and the other side is moving to expand it more.
Yeah.
And they're both reinterpreting it.
Yeah.
I'm more than comfortable anymore saying, yeah, I'm reinterpreting the Bible and I'm picking and choosing.
Yeah.
Because there's some crazy stuff in it. Just saying.
No, cherry picking is great. So it's great. You just acknowledge we're doing it. That's all right.
Is what I'm doing.
I still value a tradition. I still want to ground us in something, but let's be honest, what we're really grounded in collectively, or what we share in common, is a set of values more than anything else, But yeah, thanks, Ann. That's good. Somebody else had their hand up. Julie, did you? Or Sarah? I thought maybe I saw your hand.
I don't know if this doesn't make any sense, and it goes back to your question, Aaron, about the moral equivalency, and there's also just something I think if we're arguing, there's too much like, this is right or wrong, this is black or white, this is red or blue, and we're really getting ourselves into a corner with all of those binaries, and not enough like both and not enough like self-reflection, I think, of like, well, I'm imperfect, they're imperfect. And part of the reason for that is that there's a lot at stake right now. But what I wanted to say is something I was going to say like 2 weeks ago. We were talking about Charlie Kirk, and what I can't stop thinking about when we use terms like right and left is that it seems that the guy who murdered Charlie Kirk was a Trump supporter who also maybe, and I know Max knows a lot about this, I'm going to simplify it, maybe also thought that trans people should be loved, and that we don't anymore have the imagination to think of those two things together. So when one party sees that, it may have been motivated by Kirk's hatred of trans people, it's like, oh, that person is on the left. But he wasn't on the left. If you look at it, he was probably on the right. And that's just become like an emblem for me of how, I don't even know, it's so screwed up. I don't have the language for it. It's like, it's almost the right, and here I go with right, left, the right admitting that if you love trans people or you think they should have rights, then you're necessarily on the left.
Yeah. No.
Like, when in actuality, I think we're dealing with a shooter that doesn't fit any of the binaries through which we talk about politics or who's right or who's wrong or who has the morality. And I don't even know where I'm going.
No,
It's
I
just
appreciate-
it's
I
such a
appreciate you
sign
exposing the
of our
complexity.
depravity that we
Yeah.
can't. It's like, could the right give themselves away anymore by saying, if you don't hate trans people, then you're not one of us.
Mhm.
Like it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Michael.
No, I okay. So chaplain moment here. What I hear you saying is just the sheer complexity of it all, and our inability to sit with complexity, and not have to define everything and categorize everything and domesticate and control everything, because it's all a way of controlling. And the beauty sometimes is simply acknowledging complexity and sitting with the tension, being okay with not knowing and the tensions involved with all of
She puts in my
And,
cat.
and part
That's
of
the
that
big takeaway,
tension
maybe.
is that I acknowledge the political exigency and the strategic necessity of saying I am against what's going on here. And that puts me on the left. But in terms of my humanity, I don't like where that puts me,
Mm.
because the fact, I mean, if I'm really being honest, I have compassion for anyone who has lost their compassion or who is so wayward that they walk around hating and dehumanizing other people and something really bad happened to them.
Yeah.
There is some ache and some longing and something that is for them is not being able to be expressed. They feel embattled, they feel devalued, and so they hate. And that's the kind of complexity that my humanity wants to
Mhm.
hold. But politically, when I'm at the No Kings March, you
Yeah.
know, I'm like, I don't want this king. I am against the king.
Yeah. I hear you.
Don't give it back.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great stuff. Anybody else? Yeah, Sergio. And that'll be you continue the conversation. That'll be the end.
So I kind of want to go off on a tangent, if I could.
You want to go on a tangent?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So just to thank you and Central Avenue for helping out my client.
Oh yeah.
So I just want to explain a little bit, like, what I do
Please,
there.
that's great. Go.
Okay, so I am a housing retention case manager, and our mission is to, end homelessness one person at a time. And so what I do is, once they're housed, they house them before they get to me. So once they're housed, I'm supposed to teach them life skills towards independence,
Mm.
but they're not all going to make it.
Yeah.
And see, the thing is, like, sometimes, like, if the part of the program is, there's laws, there's policies, regulations that she can't live there without any electricity.
Yeah.
So to be honest with you, I was kind of annoyed when, like, because I was out for like a week, and I come back and her lights were off. She had been like that since I was gone.
Yeah.
She was like living with no lights,
Wow.
and they knew about this, but I don't know what happened. How come they didn't intervene sooner? So I always told them that she needs more than what this program could offer, because it's supposed to teach them to be independent.
Yeah.
But she has a mental illness, which a lot of people dismiss. They think, that it's something you could will away. And, working there, what I discovered is, like, when I see people, when they're on medication, when they stop taking it, it's just, it's so funny how, I don't know if she has a BPD, which is bipolar
Yeah.
personality disorder. I don't know if, I mean, a lot of families have, relatives with that, but it's just, when you see them not take their education, you see the difference, and it almost becomes tangible how different they become. And so, but like now I want to thank you because we are going to transition her to an apartment where she has a case manager 24 hours a day. But this has made it easier because we could take our time to like do that because she has her lights back on and everything. She wants to thank you too. I think she says she has a card for you for the church, and I just hadn't this year Friday.
Well, that once we get the card, we'll read it up here.
Okay.
But Sergio, it's so important, the work that you're doing and the partnership we can have with Ascensia. We've had a partnership, as you know, with Ascensia for years.
Mhm.
This is a different level.
Right.
But thank you. And it's a great way for us to remember who we are, why we're doing what we're doing, and what it means to be a spiritual community and a Christian community too. So
Right.
thank you, Sergio, for reminding us of that this morning.
Can I just say one more thing? I
Yeah,
just
go
hope,
ahead, man.
when I was in school, I just remember that, just they were discussing Reaganomics
Reaganomics?
and how he got rid of a lot of the mental institutions.
Yeah, that's right.
And so they're saying that these are the effects. I don't know if you go out and you see, how it is. Like it's just seems like it's there's more people with like mental illnesses,
Mm-hmm.
but they say it's the after effects
Yes,
from that.
I've heard that.
And so just, hope that there's more like, we could push more mental health awareness.
Yeah.
Because, it is very prevalent. Like, they call the society trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of trauma, where like COVID caused, like a society, like trauma on the level of
Right.
communities and society. And yeah, no, I mean, that's pretty much it. But yes, we wholeheartedly appreciate your help.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you, Sergio. And thank you to everybody who's here today. And we'll see you again next week right here, 10:15. All right. Yeah, Julie, benediction. Gosh, I still got to get in the habit of that. I'm so out of the. Thank you so much. Somebody will always be here to remind me. Let us close together with this joint affirmation of benediction. As we go from this place, we commit ourselves to the path of love, honesty, and humility. We dedicate ourselves as Christ to the cause of justice and the courageous embrace this life, this world, and each other. Thank you so much. Amen. Thank you, Julie. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening in on this week's edition of the Central Cast. Hope you enjoyed it and hope you join us next time. Bye-bye.